Since this course is about IT auditing, here are some subcategories of the IT general controls. We don't go into this in depth in this particular course, but it's good to give you guys an overview of what the subcategories are. The categories are logical security, which has to do with access. We also have program changes, program development, computer operations, physical and environmental controls. Now let's discuss the types of tests that we perform for controls. In order to test controls, you have to first determine if the control is designed adequately before you determine if it is operating effectively. The test of design is to determine whether a control is properly designed, such that if it were implemented as designed, it would operate effectively. This means that you test the control to determine if there are any gaps or issues that will prevent it from working as it is designed. For example, let's take a look at password controls. If you want to test the design of password controls that state that passwords must be alphanumeric, you want to make sure that there are documented policies in place to govern the password settings for IT systems. You would want to make sure that the system being tested also has the capability to support alphanumeric passwords. If there are no corporate policies that require alphanumeric passwords, or if the system is unable to support alphanumeric passwords, then the control is not properly designed because it will fail when you try to test the operating effectiveness. The test of design can be performed using several methods so that we can conclude on the appropriateness of the design, and we'll go over that in the next slide. The test of operating effectiveness comes after the test of design, and it's used to determine if the control is operating as intended when it was designed. Going with the example of password controls, in order to test the operating effectiveness of that control, we would obtain the password settings from the system that's been audited and make sure that the settings, the configuration settings, require alphanumeric passwords from users. Showing that the setting is enabled will be the evidence that the control for alphanumeric passwords is operating effectively. There are also several methods that can be used to perform tests of operating effectiveness, and we'll also go over that in the next slide. Before we wrap up this slide, there are certain things that we need to consider when we're performing a test of operating effectiveness. You have to consider the nature of the control. Is it an automated control or is it manual? This will impact the type of evidence that you need to review for testing. You also have to consider the frequency of the operation. How often is the control performed? This will impact the selection size that you need to make to test. And you also have to consider the significance of the control and the risk of failure. How important is this control? How key is it? Is it a key control? And is it prone to failure? This will also impact the selection sizes that you make when you're testing this particular control. We'll go over selection sizes in a different lecture. In general, all these items will help determine how you design the test to be performed and how you make the selection of items that you will test. Next, let's talk about testing techniques. On the previous slide, I mentioned that there are various methods to perform test of design and test of operating effectiveness. Here are some techniques and methods. For test of design, we typically perform inquiry first, which is the same as asking people questions via an interview. We inspect documents and then we also observe processes. You have to use at least 2 of these methods for test of design because inquiry alone is never sufficient for test of design. In cases where it is absolutely impossible to inspect evidence or observe processes, it might be acceptable to perform what is called a corroborative inquiry, which means asking 2 or more people the same set of interview questions in order to determine if their responses regarding the process and control are the same. For test of operating effectiveness, you can utilize the techniques listed here. Let's go through each one. Observation means that you can observe a process occur to make sure the control is performed as part of that process. An example would be observing someone using their badge to access the server room to test the control that access to the server room is restricted by badge access. Inspection means that you review evidence provided to you to determine if the control is operating effectively. For example, let us look at the server room access control. You can request and obtain a report from the badge system to determine if only approved individuals have the server room permissions on their badges. You want to make sure that everybody doesn't have the server room permissions on their badge, and that's restricted only to individuals that need to access the server room. Reperformance means that you are performing the control again to determine if you arrive at the same conclusion as the originally performed control. An example here would be, for example, a reconciliation control, where you reconcile the same items in the process and see if you come up with the same results. Recalculation means that you calculate items from the control again to determine if you come up with the same results. For example, if the control is supposed to calculate two numbers in different accounts for reconciliation, you can manually recalculate those numbers to make sure that the numbers that were used in the reconciliation were correct. The last item that we have here is a system query. This means you can run reports from the system to view new users that are created, changes made to a field, or other applicable reports that can be used for control testing. For example, if you want to test the approval process for new users, you can run a report from the system of all new user accounts that were created. And then you can use that list to make a selection that you would then test to determine if each user had an access request form completed and properly approved by their manager. So this actually has two elements, the example I just used. You use the system query to generate a report that you can use for selection. And then when you get your evidence for the selection, you can then use the inspection to perform a test to make sure that all the elements of the controls were met. This concludes the lecture on testing techniques. Let's go into selection sizes.